Go ahead and get started. This is, we have a lot of chapters, or I mean, a lot of verses to cover tonight.
9 pages.
Heavenly Father, again, as we come together to partake of your word, to be fed on what you have for us, I pray you will anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things you'd have to be said. Anoint our hearts to receive, that we can be full. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, tonight we're going to cover some rather touchy subjects tonight. But we'll just go along through them. Hi. Okay, I guess we're all set. All right. All right, so we're going to learn about Amnon and Tamar. And this is 2 Samuel chapter 13, beginning with verse 1. After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin, and it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. So Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother. Now Jonadab was a very crafty man. And he said to him, "Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner day after day? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." So Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me food, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" Okay, so what we have here is a situation of incest. And that's what we'll be talking about tonight.
Yeah.
The first part of tonight. So we have this young man named Amnon. He was the son of David. So who was his mother? Well, the mother of Tamar and Absalom was Micah, who was the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And we've heard about him in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and 1 Chronicles chapter 3. So Geshur was an independent kingdom that existed in land that was given to the half-tribe of Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan River. So over there was this little kingdom, and they're called Geshur, and it was an independent kingdom. It was just kind of there. Manasseh was never able to drive them out of the country. I don't know if they even actually tried, but they kind of had an alliance with Geshur, and they just kind of coexisted over there on that land. Now Tamar was a very beautiful girl and a virgin, which meant that she was kept in seclusion, and these virgins were only allowed around men when accompanied by a chaperone or a witness. So what we had here was this beautiful girl called Tamar, who was would be the sister or stepsister, if you will, of this young man, and she was beautiful, and she captured his attention. All of a sudden his lust started burning, and it got worse and worse. Now Amnon was also the son of David, and his third wife, Ahinoam of Jezreel. You remember, the wife of Saul.
Right.
And you remember when Saul gave Michal, who was to David, to another man, Michal went and got this and brought her over. So, it was in the middle. This whole thing is, you look at it and you say, "Oh my goodness, what's going on here?" Oh, boy. But Amnon was David's eldest son. That meant he was heir apparent to the throne.
Right.
And as such, it seems that he was also pampered. He was one of those kids that, don't touch that. Don't do that. Don't want to hurt his feelings. He's heir apparent to the throne. And he was kind of David's favorite. And we'll see this as it works out a little bit later. All right. So Amnon's desire for Tamar became so strong that he could no longer eat. That's all he could think about. The Bible talks about lust, and it says lust, when it is conceived, brings forth sin. And sin, when it's finished, brings death.
Yeah.
And we're going to see how true that really is in this story tonight. So poor Amnon, he's so focused on this girl that he can't eat, and so he's losing weight, and he's in a terrible state. And I know how it is with teenagers. Sometimes they get in these situations. But most of the time it's because they don't have anything else to think about.
Yeah.
Or anything to do.
What do they say? The mind is the devil's workshop.
Yeah.
If you don't keep that mind busy with something else, he's going to get in there and he's going to cause problems. And that's what was happening with Amnon. He knew he could not do anything with Tamar. He could not marry her. He could not do anything with her. If they even saw each other, just passed in a hallway, there had to be an adult there with them, or a witness or a chaperone with them. And so poor guy, and he's evidently not very bright. Is the other thing, and we'll see this as we go along here. But Amnon, he had a cousin, and his cousin's name was Jonadab. Now, in Leviticus 18:6 and 18:11, the law specifically prohibited any sexual relations between half-brothers and half-sisters. It was absolutely forbidden. In the law, specifies it exactly.
And even sisters and brothers.
What's that? All right. So this was known to Amnon as well as Jonadab. But Jonadab, he being a crafty man, or sly, wise, however you wanted to look at it. To me, he was really kind of stupid. But he had this ability to know what was going on and being always involved in things. I have a cousin who married a fella, and he's a preacher. He's pastoring in Portland. But from the time I first met him, it's amazing who he knows. He's from Chicago, and I know we went to visit him. We stopped in to visit. He said, "Let's go out to eat." So we're down in South Chicago. He said, "This is where the gangsters all used to be, the mafia and all these places." And we go into this place and sit down, and we're going to eat this, I forget what it was, some kind of not novelty, but ethnic food. It was, I don't know, Bulgarian or something. And we're sitting there, and he says, "Yeah, this is where, this gangster and that gangster, used to be where they ate all the time." And, where he's telling us all about it. He turns around and he says, "Hey, Marcus, come on over here. I'd like to meet my cousin. He's the guy that owns a restaurant that serves these guys." He's an old guy, and he's introduced us to all these people. And the next thing I know, we're someplace else. He said, "Oh, let me come over here. And this is the mayor." The mayor wasn't there, but it's that level of he just knows everybody, and he's one of these guys who's got a plan for everything.
Yeah.
And yet, you look at him and talk to him, and you think, "Well, this guy isn't very smart at all." But he's one of those kind of people that just always has this ability And that's kind of the way this Jonadab was, and we'll see more about him a little later. But Jonadab comes up with a plan, and he was an evil man. And actually, Amnon had no business even listening to this guy. If Amnon was smart, he would have just said, I better go take a cold shower and get this over with. But instead of that, he confided in Jonadab, and Jonadab came up with this idea. And he said, here's what you do. You fake illness. And you go lay down in your bed, and you fake the fact you're ill, and you can't eat anything. And so when David comes to visit you, because you're his favorite, he'll come and see how you're doing, and make his house call, or his hospital visit, or whatever you want to call it. You tell him that you just really can't eat it, and you'd like to have your half-sister Tamar fix a couple of cakes and bring them over and hand feed them to me. If I can just see them being made, and she can bring them over, and it sounded plausible. Now the commentaries do point out that David, being a wise man, how could he possibly be taken in by that one?
Right.
But he was. And so what the plan was to get Tamar into Amnon's house without the chaperone. That was the whole plan here. And I don't know that Jonadab had any idea how far Amnon would go. He probably thought, well, just being around her would satisfy his desires. I don't know that he actually knew how far this was going to go, but this was the plan. So Amnon, verse 6, then Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, please let Tamar, my sister, come and make a couple of cakes for my sight, that I may eat from her hand. And David sent home to Tamar, saying, now go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was lying down. Then she took flour and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and placed them out before him, but he refused to eat. Then Amnon said, have everyone go out for me. And they all went out from him. Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the bedroom, that I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made, and brought them to Amnon her brother in the bedroom. Now when she had brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come lie with me, my sister. But she answered him, no, my brother, do not force me, for no thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And where could I take my shame? And as for you, you would be like the fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. However, he would not heed her voice, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her.
Wow.
All right, so the plan worked exactly as they planned. David heard that Amnon was ill, and so he went to see Amnon, see how he's doing. Now notice Amnon's choice of words in describing Tamar as his sister. That was meant to calm any fears or anything David might, or thoughts David, that he had some kind of a sexual or lustful desire towards Tamar. Send my sister. Well, she wasn't his sister; he was his half sister. Okay, so it was a little bit different than really what he was saying. His words were there to try to smooth the thing out. Now, David violated the custom of only allowing a virgin to visit a man with a chaperone.
Yes, he did.
He violated what was really his own rules, because these were the rules to the virgins that were in the royal family. If you lived out in the country, you didn't keep your young lady, behind and secluded with a chaperone all the time. It was a little more freer. But when it came to the royal family, and you had to have a chaperone, here he violated his own custom and his own rules. Now the cakes that were talked about here was not just a normal cake. The cakes were a fancy bread that the women took great pride in preparing. So Tamar was no doubt flattered, and I don't know how old she was, probably quite young in those days. You got married when you were 15 or 16, so she was probably 13, 14 years old. And to be asked to prepare, these spaniels for Amnon, and to be asked by the king, man, that was really, something, even though it was her grandfather. Or be her father, that didn't matter. And so all of this worked well. So after she baked the cakes, the bread, Amnon refused to eat it. He says, no, have everybody, just get everybody out of here. I need you to hand feed me. I need you to, I'll open my mouth and you put it in.
Yeah.
Now, this shows me where Tamar should have been headed for the door by that time.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm leaving with the rest of them. You want to eat it? Then. The problem was that Amnon specifically asked that Tamar feed him by hand. And that's the instructions that David gave to Tamar. So if she had left, she would have been violating her father's wishes, who, by the way, is a king. Not a good thing. All right. So they went into the bedroom, and Amnon took the opportunity to rape her over her protestations. She made some very good points. Number one, she told him that it was not approved in Israel. Now, that you may look at that and say, well, that's obvious, But it was approved in other nations. Other nations looked at that and said, oh, well, that's your sister-in-law, it's all in the family, that's fine and good. So it was approved in the nations around. It was not approved in Israel. She called the act a disgrace, folly. And from that probably came from Genesis 34:7. And in that particular story, the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard that one of the men in Israel, one of the brothers, had actually raped one of Jacob's daughters. And when they came out of the fields, they were grieved and they were very wroth because he had wrought folly in Israel in laying with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. So she knew about that story, and she knew how the men called this man a folly. And this particular man, by the way, his name was Shechem, loved the woman. It was one of those situations, where probably things got carried away. Because it says he loved her greatly. To the point that he said, I'll pay whatever. The dowry, whatever you want. I'll do whatever you want just to keep her. It was a love relationship. And maybe they were, went out, they didn't have cars in those days, but on a date, things kind of get carried away, and before you know it, you're doing things you should not be doing. That was more the situation there. And it's a long story, but in the end, all these brothers got together and wiped out Shechem's whole house. All of his brothers, all the men of the city or town, they killed them all. All because of that. And now we have a situation that's similar, only far worse, because this guy, he was only filled with lust. He didn't really love her. We find out that in a minute. All right. She questioned how it would look for her. She called him a fool, basically. She said, if you do this, you're a fool. But how is it going to look for me? Because people would know that she was no longer a virgin, and she would be considered an outcast. And Amnon would be considered the same way as the fool who raped Dinah and ended up being killed. The girl's name was Dinah back in Jacob's daughter. She advised Amnon, instead of raping her, to go talk to her dad. Because she said, he doesn't turn you down anytime. He'll give you whatever. He never says no. Even though, in this case, it would be a violation of the law, because David evidently gave him whatever he wanted. Go ask, he'll give it to you. We'll get married. That's the way it works. And he refused to do that. Our granddaughter, at the deal Saturday, he said to my wife, she said, yeah, well, we're going to go up here and play foosball or something. And she said, when I told her not to or something, and she says, well, I'll go ask Pastor Rick. He never says no. She only sees him once in a while. I thought that was, she's got 7 years old. She's got him pegged, you know.
Yeah.
All right, verse 15. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, arise, be gone.
Wow.
So she said to him, no, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me. But he would not listen to her. Then he called his servants who attended him and said, here, put this woman out away from me, and bolt the door behind her. Now she had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters wore such apparel. And his servant put her out and bolted the door behind her. Then Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her robe of many colors that was on her, and she laid her hand upon her head and went away crying bitterly. And Absalom, her brother, said to her, has Amnon your brother, been with you? But now, hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. But when King David heard all these things, he was very angry. And Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon neither good nor bad. Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. Okay, so we see this guy that's so burned up with lust, who is obviously a spoiled brat that got whatever he wanted. And so as soon as he was finished with Tamar, he just threw her out the door. And how many guys today, that's exactly what they're after? We try to tell young people, be careful, don't go with people, first thing you know, they're in trouble.
Anyway.
Well, who's the father? Well, I'm not saying. He's because he threw you out. They don't want anything to do with you. He's not interested in marriage and commitment. He's interested in a one-night fun stand. But after he had committed the act,
No problem.
all of his lust turned to hate.
Yeah, we had the windows in, but
Yeah.
All of that lust turned to hate. All of the emotions of guilt and shame, contempt, and the loss that was likely to follow swept over him. You know, it's amazing after you've done something wrong, how all of a sudden your thinking clears up, and you say, "Oops, I guess that wasn't a good idea." Because now I think Amnon began to realize what he had lost. He was heir apparent to the throne. He had violated the law, and by the law, the only punishment that could be given to him was death. He was to die. And certainly if he didn't die, he would never be accepted as the next king of Israel. Think about his loss. All of the strength and the satisfaction of his lust could not overpower the realization of his sin. And sometimes we have, it may not be lust, it could be anything that drives us to sin in one way. And it's surprising how often after we have attained what we think is so great and wonderful, that attainment is not overpowering enough to cover our sins, to cover our feeling of shame, to cover the fact that we now realize what we have. She looked at him, she said, "No, I'm not leaving. I'm not going to go, because evil of sending me away is worse than what you did to me." What could be worse than being raped? Well, if we go back to Genesis, in the account of Genesis, Shammai, who had relations with Jacob's daughter, Dinah, he kept her in his house. He intended to marry her. He stood up and said, I did this. He admitted his guilt and said, I'm responsible. I'll take the responsibility. This guy, on the other hand, said, throw her out and bolt the door. If she says I did it, I didn't do it. Now, all of a sudden, she's no longer a virgin. Now, how is she going to prove what happened? There were no witnesses. Everybody was gone. Her word against his.
Right.
So what is the natural assumption of the community? Could have been anybody. So she is now considered a prostitute or a harlot. So, and of course the life of a harlot was much different than the life of the king's daughter. So the sin that he committed against her was far worse in throwing her out than in the actual rape. Because the rape, it's hard to say, but it was almost one of the common things in those days. I mean, they just seemed to let their lust fly. But in not taking the responsibility and not bringing her in, left her out in the open, completely. Who's going to take care of me now? If Amma didn't take the responsibility, she could not prove that she had been raped. Had her thrown out, her and her beautiful coat of many colors. These coats of many colors were embroidered. They were very fancily hand embroidered. And it was, if you had one of these, it indicated you were a virgin in the royal family. You had this beautiful coat on, and everybody knew. So a man was caught talking to one of these ladies without a chaperone present. They
get in trouble, huh?
Yeah, it could be off with your head. And, David decided that's what he wanted to do. If everybody knew the rules. You stay away from them. That's what that coat of many colors meant. If you wanted to marry her, of course, then you went to the father. Or in the case of the royal family, they usually had a servant who was in charge of that, one man that was responsible for the harem or the women in the court. And so you would go to him and say, I'd like to marry this one particular girl, and that person then would take it to the king, and they would, you'd work out a dowry and all that sort of thing, and you marry her. And that was how things were done. But one thing you did not do is violate one of these virgins. And they had these beautiful coats of many colors. It says when she went out from him, she tore this coat, this robe of many colors. She tore it. And she put ashes on her head, which was a sign of mourning. And she went off weeping bitterly. So everybody that saw her realized, number one, she's no longer a virgin. Number two, she's mourning. It was not something that she did in a happy, gay time. And now the question was, where do I go? She lived in her father's house, in the palace. Now she can't go there. She's no longer a virgin. She's now an outcast. In those days, when situations like this occurred, or for instance, your sister's husband was killed, if you were the brother, then you were responsible to take care of your sister. And oftentimes, the father of the girl that didn't even, it was left up to the brother, from the time they were little, not necessarily to raise them, but to take responsibility for them. So if anything happened, they were the big brother that stepped in, and somebody needed to have a little correction. Big brother stepped in and corrected it. And it was the big brothers of Jacob who came out of the fields and ended up killing Shechem and all of his people. And it was the brothers. That's their responsibility. It wasn't Jacob. He didn't do it. And so she went to Absalom, her brother. And Absalom took her in the house. And as soon as he saw her, he realized what had happened. And he gave her some advice. And at first, we look at this advice and we say, what in the world? Why are you telling her this, Absalom? He says, he said, hold your peace. Don't tell anybody. Just keep it quiet. You'll stay here with me, secluded. You'll be separated and secluded. You live in my house. I'll take care of you, but don't tell anybody what happened. And that seems to be a kind of a poor way of approaching it. You'd think you'd want to go out, and tell the king and tell everybody what happened and point your finger at Amnon and have him arrested and put to death. The way he treated her, that's what needed to happen. But Absalom was a son of David also, and he realized that any thing that was brought against Amnon would apply against all of the house of David. It would be used as a political weapon against David. Golly, has that changed anything in all these thousands of years? I mean, what do we see in the news? Well, you did this to this person. No, you did this to that person. Well, this person says when I was 16, I'm 65 now, but when I was 16,
Yeah,
you see, it goes on and on and on and on.
yeah.
And nobody can prove anything. It's just a bunch of accusations. Some true, some not true, and some true in somebody's mind. It hasn't changed. And so Absalom realizes, he said, just keep it quiet. Don't worry about it. Don't take it to heart. Don't let it tear you down. It was encouragement, kind of. He was trying to encourage Tamar. So he said, just keep it quiet. And so Tamar did. She remained in the house of Absalom. She was separated. She was appalled. She was no longer sought after for marriage. And she was destined to live a life of being unloved. Can you imagine having the reality that you may face the rest of your life being unloved? Because something you had absolutely no control over. Now she had to move out of David's house, who was her protector, under Jewish custom, where she was to live a solitary and separate life. Now when David learned of this, I read this, is when David heard of these things, he was very angry. He was so angry that he
Yeah,
what did you do, David?
Nothing.
that's right.
Oh, wait, you can't do it. This is Abner. This is my favorite. How could I possibly do anything against poor Abner? You know, we think about David, how wise he was, and what a great warrior. But when it came to some things, he was as dumb as a post and blinder than a bat.
Yep, that's for sure.
Anything, he covered it up. Between him and Absalom, they kept it quiet. And notice Absalom, it says this, and when Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon, he didn't speak either good or bad. He didn't say anything to him about it. He never mentioned it. He never said he was good or bad. He was just Absalom and Amnon, and you know, we're just kind of here hanging out. And all the time Absalom hated Amnon.
Yeah,
You see, David would have been so much better off if he would have dealt with the situation.
Right.
Cost Amnon his life, but it would have put David in a much better position, and he wouldn't have to have faced things that he's going to have to face later. Putting off judgment for sin never does any good. It always will bring something worse.
Yeah.
Something worse. All right. And his hatred of Amnon was no doubt fed by David's inaction in punishing, and not punishing, I should say, Amnon. All right, verse 23. And it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. Then Absalom came to the king and said, kindly note, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servants. With your servant, me, Absalom, come with me. But the king said to Absalom, no, my son, let us not all go now, lest we be a burden to you. Then he urged him, but he would not go, and he blessed him. Then Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom urged him, so he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, watch now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each one got on his mule and fled.
Wow.
So Absalom, what was happening here is that every year they would have their sheep shearing. And it was a yearly time. You remember we talked about the reapers. We talked especially in the book of Ruth. When they had finished reaping and they brought all of the grains in, what did they do? They had a huge feast, and it might go on for 2 or 3 days. And you invited all of the families of your workers, and you invited your own family and friends, and they came and had a big party that lasted for 2 or 3 days. Well, the sheep herders did the same thing, and they would have this large party. So it was at the time of the year when the sheep were to be shorn, and of course Absalom was a son of David, but he also had sheep. You know, just because you were the king's son, you didn't live off the king necessarily. You had to have your own means of income. You were expected to be businessman or a farmer or whatever. And Absalom had sheep. He was a sheep herder. And so his flock was in a little town. It was about 8 miles northeast of Jerusalem, a little town up there called Ephraim. And it was just out of there that he had his sheep. And so Absalom came to David, and he said, he first of all sent a note to all of his brothers, all the sons of David, and said, bring your families and your servants, come on up, we're going to have a party. You're all invited. We're shearing sheep, and you all come up, all of you. Like we would do right now. We're planning Thanksgiving, and we're calling our relatives and friends, hey, come on over and be with us. And, we were just talking, one of my granddaughter's boyfriend's brother is going to be there. I don't know that. I says, oh, that don't matter, we got plenty. But, invite everybody. And so he came into the king and he said, King, David, Dad, hey, I'm having this sheep shearing party. Come on down. Bring your servants and come on down. And David said, no, I'm not going to do that. Because if I come with you, I'm bringing my 600 bodyguards with me. His servants were his bodyguards. That's 600 men. He's not going anywhere without them. Because if he goes someplace without them, he's leaving himself open. So he has to have his army with him. He has to have all of his servants. And he said, the cost to you, you couldn't afford to have us come to your festival. And of course, Absalom, he tried, and David said, no, I'm not coming. And so David blessed him. Now, we think David, put his hand on his head and say, oh, bless you, son. No, David gave him money. That's how he blessed him. I remember I used to visit my dad, and there were times when I didn't have a whole lot of money, I had 3 little kids and stuff, and we'd go visit mom and dad. He would, well, come on, we're going down the service station. And he always blessed me by filling my tank with his credit card. To this day, I am so thankful. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I had enough to get home. He'd fill my tank and I'd be able to go home. And that's kind of what David was doing here. He's blessing him and saying, oh, blessing him. And so he said, David, he said, well, if you can't come, Amnon is the heir apparent. He's the next in line. Can he come? And I see a little bit of, why do you want him to come? Is there a little something going on here? Maybe he detected a little something. But he said, but Absalom urged him. And probably told him, look, Dad, you're the king. This is the next guy in line. Man, it would really honor us if he and his servants would be sure and be there, because this is the heir apparent. This is the next in line, And boy, not only am I a son, but here, and all our sons are there, but here's the heir apparent, And so David agreed to go with Absalom. So it came the night for the party. Everybody's there. And they're putting the food out. They got the wine out there. They're feasting. They're chomping away on the lamb bones and throwing them over their shoulders or whatever they did. I don't know. Knights of the Round Table. They were eating and drinking and having a great old time. And Absalom told his servants, he says, now you watch Amnon, and when he gets drunk, I'm going to give you the word, and you jump on him and kill him. Now, why he had to wait for him to get drunk, I don't know. I think his servants could have overpowered him probably at any time. But when he gets drunk, you kill him. And don't worry about it. I'm giving the commands. I am also a son of the king. And in fact, once he's dead, I become the heir apparent. Now we're starting to see a little, this is a great opportunity here. Yeah. And so he told us, sir, don't worry about it, I got your back. You just do what I told you to do. And so sure enough, as soon as Amnon had enough to drink and was drunk, they jumped on him and killed him. And as soon as he did that, as soon as they killed him, all the other sons of David jumped on their mules and took off. Now this would not be a time to have a stubborn mule. You want to make sure you have a mule that's going to go when you need to go. But I can see all these sons of David and their servants running and jumping on their mules and taking off, and servants running everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys had no way of knowing who planned it. They didn't know who the target was. Was this something Absalom was doing to kill all the sons off? Or was this some foreign, somebody had infiltrated and hired these guys to come in and kill all the sons? They didn't know what was going on. They jumped on their mules. All they knew was Jerusalem's that way. That's where we're going. We're headed home. Verse 30, and it came to pass while they were on their way, that news came to David saying, Absalom has killed all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. What I'd like to know is if the sons of David took off on their mules as soon as they could, how did anybody outrun them?
Yeah.
They had to have had a telephone. Not a cell phone. They texted to David, I know. The king arose and tore his garments and lay on the ground, and all of his servants stood by with their clothes torn. So here's David laying on the ground. He rips his clothes. He's laying down, getting ready to mourn the death of all of his sons. Here's his soldiers. They rip their clothes, but they're not on the ground. They're standing guard. Because if somebody killed all of
The other soldiers.
David's sons, who's going to come for David? Who's next?
Yeah.
So I can see his servants, I can see the 600 men, they all tear their clothes. You can see them all lined up around David, and here they are. Come on, wherever you are, we're ready for you. Can you see the chaos that had to have been going on here? Verse 32, here's our old buddy. Then Jonadab, the son of Shimei, David's brother, same Jonadab, answered and said, Let not my lord suppose they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. For by the command of Absalom this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart to think that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead. How did he know that? Only way he could have known that is if he was in on it.
Right.
You see, this was one of those guys that knew everything and was involved with everything, and there was nothing happening that he didn't have his hand in. He may have been the one that suggested the whole thing to Absalom in the first place. And notice how he switches sides. It was his idea in the first place with Amnon to get Tamar aside. Now he's saying, well, Absalom, he's just doing this to get back at Amnon because he hates Amnon. Playing both sides against the middle. You ever run into people like that? They're the ones you need to stay away from. All right. Verse 34. Then Absalom fled. What was going on at the feast, as soon as they killed Amnon, and all of David's sons ran and jumped on their mules, guess who also came and jumped on their mule? Absalom. You see, nobody knew at that point who had done what to who. And so by jumping on his mule with the rest of his brothers and taking off, it left the appearance that he didn't have anything to do with it.
Right.
Now he just got through telling the servants, I'm backing you up.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's backing you up, all right. You see his back going down the road, bouncing on that mule. Only while the rest of the sons went back to Jerusalem, he took off over the Jordan River and went to his grandfather's house, who was the king of Shur. And the young man who was keeping watch lifted his eyes and looked, and there were many people were coming from the road on the hillside behind him. So Jonadab said to the king, "Look, the king's sons are coming, as your servant said, so it is." So it was, as soon as he had finished speaking, that the king's sons indeed came, and they lifted up their voice and wept. Also the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. All right. Very confusing portion of scripture here. Very confusing, and I'll explain why. All right. All right. One of the young men was standing watch. He was a watchman. And what's interesting here is it says, while he was watching, he heard something behind him, or something caught his attention. And he turned around, and on the road that went on the hillside behind him, he saw all of these men coming, these people coming. What's interesting is this whole structure of happening behind him in Jewish writing, Hebrew, was that they were considered to be facing east. Always were considered to be facing east, which meant the road behind him would have been west. You say, what's that got to do with anything? What's that got to do with anything? Well, he was watching the main road that came into Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem in those days, not Jerusalem of today, it was the city of David, which is on the south side of Jerusalem. The old city had nothing to do with David. David's city was on a little hill, and we saw it just on the south end of the wall that goes around the Dome of the Rock. If you see pictures of Dome of the Rock, they got that wall, that goes around. The south end, there's just a little rise, like a little hill. That was the city of David. That's as big as David's city was, just that little hill. And in fact, I was watching a video, almost got so enraptured I didn't. But they have a tour video tour of this. They actually go down inside and several layers down, and you can see where the actual city of David is. And they think they found the walls for David's palace, in fact, and stuff. And it's very, very interesting. But it was just a little place. And the way to get there, especially from somebody who was north, because remember they were 8 miles northeast, that would have been 8 miles northeast over this way. So if the watchman was looking for Saul's or for David's sons to come, they would naturally be watching that road. It was the main road to Jericho at that time. And it comes down, and then it would go around behind all of it. And that's where even Jesus went that way to go up to Bethany. And so anybody coming would be coming that way and up the Kidron Valley to the city of David. But for some reason, they circumvented and came in the back way. And on the back side, there was a series of steps that led from a little used road up into the city. And that's where these men came, the sons of David. Why would they do that? Simply to avoid an ambush. Why else? The fastest route would be to come this way. That's how David got the news before they got there. A messenger took off and went the straight route. They circumvented and came this way, probably to avoid any possible ambushes. And remember, they had no clue who was killing who.
Right.
It could have been the Philistines, Amalekites, Ammonites, anybody, Edomites, Buggasites, who knows? It could have been anybody. So they came the back way. All right. Now, it's interesting also that Jonadab took the opportunity. Hey, king, remember I told you? Say, I'm right. Here they come, just like I told you.
Yeah.
That one, that's sounds so like people I know. All right. After the sons got to David, they all wept bitterly, and that just means profusely. It was probably a mix of gratitude and, you know, hey, everybody's alive, and sorrow at the loss of Amnon. All right. And meanwhile, Absalom fled to his grandfather Talmai, king of Geshur. Now, because his murder was premeditated, there was no anything in the law that he could point to keep from being killed. Premeditated murder, you were killed. That was it. They set up cities of refuge, but the city of refuge would not work because that was only set up if you killed somebody accidentally.
Yeah.
It'd be like we call manslaughter today. You could go there and you were safe. So that didn't work. So the only place he could go was to his grandfather, and that was a place where they probably looked on his action and said, "Hey, you did good. You know, this guy, you know, raped your sister. You did good in going out there and killing him. That was the right thing to do." So it made sense to go there. Now Absalom stayed there for 3 years, and this is where it gets a little confusing. If you just read this, but Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. And you get the impression he was mourning for Absalom. And some of the commentaries even make that, you know, well, he was mourning for Absalom. No, he wasn't. He was mourning for Amnon, the son that was slain. Why would he mourn for Absalom? Absalom's not dead. No, he was mourning for Amnon. And then it goes on to say, so Absalom went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. Again, we get the impression he wanted to go find Absalom, to wrap his arms around him because he was his favorite son. He wasn't. Amnon was his favorite son. This longing, the wording in here in the Hebrew, is not to go and meet Absalom as father and son. It is more likely meant that David longed to go after Absalom and bring him back to Jerusalem for judgment, because he had been comforted from the loss of his dead son. He could not go after Absalom while he was in the period of mourning. Okay? So he longed, he wanted to go and bring Absalom back and pour out judgment. But he couldn't do it until after he'd finished mourning. And then he was restrained because, again, if he goes and gets Absalom and brings him back and puts him on trial and kills him, what does this do to the political landscape around him? There would be those that said, "What are you doing that for?" You know, clearly he was acting just like the sons of Jacob, and nobody put them to death. So you see, he had a problem. If he became, this is what the law says, this is what we're going to do, this is the will of God, then he would have lost political clout and friends. So it put him in a very tenuous situation. All right. Let's move quickly through chapter 14. Verse 1. So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom, and Joab sent to Tekoa, and brought from there a wise woman, and said to her, "Please pretend to be a mourner, and put on mourning apparel. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who has been mourning a long time for the dead." So the king, go to the king and speak to him in this manner. So Joab put the words in her mouth. Now Joab, being the commander of the army, was the man closest to David. Not only that, he had been with David since the very beginning. When David took off running away from Saul, it was Joab who was one of the men that were with him. So he knew David better than anybody else. And he realized there was a problem with David. David had inter-conflict. I love Absalom, and I really want to reach out to Absalom. But I hate Absalom, and I really want to put him in judgment. You know, there was this conflict going on. And so Joab, he designed a plan. And he realized that while David's conscious and attentive to the law forbid him, his heart longed to see Absalom. So it was a conflict between his conscience and his heart. Which one do I follow? And so what David needed was a pretense, a reason to bring Absalom home. So Joab devised a plan. So he went to Tekoa, which was about 10 miles south of Jerusalem, and he found there a wise woman. And we don't know anything about this woman, except she was a widow, but we don't know anything about her. We do know from history that there were two wise women in this area, in two little towns. One of them was actually an elder in the town, one of the leaders. But they were considered to be extremely wise. This may have been one of the two that Joab went and got. She was a very wise woman. And so the woman was to dress in the clothes of mourning, which was, tattered clothes, ashes on her head, dirty. She was not to anoint herself with oil. In other words, don't put on perfumes, because they used the perfumed oil. Man, you just come the way you are. You're in mourning, and you've been in mourning a long time. And so you're playing the part of a mourner. Now, some people say this might be very difficult, but in those days, you hired mourners. I mean, you went out and said, Eleanor, I want you to be a mourner. I need a mourner at my funeral. And so you'd come over there, and you'd be in mourning clothes, and you'd be wailing and crying and tears going everywhere. And as soon as it was over, okay, where's my money? Thank you. We're off we go. And that's what they did. That was the custom of that day. So it was not hard to find a woman who could do this, and it would not have been difficult for her to do this. So the women, verse 5, and when the woman of Tekoa spoke to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and prostrated herself and said, Help, O king. Then the king said to her, What troubles you? And she said, Indeed, I am a widow. My husband is dead. Now your maidservant had 2 sons, and the one fought with the other in the field, and there was no one to part them. But the one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole family has risen up against your maidservant, and they said, Deliver him who struck his brother, that we may execute him for the life of his brother whom he killed, and we will destroy the heir also. So they would extinguish my ember that is left, and leave to my husband neither man nor remnant on the earth. Then the king said to the woman, Go to your house, and I will give you orders concerning you. So the story that she tells here, the issue is that the last son, okay, the remaining son, if he is killed by the relatives, then there would be no posterity for her husband. And that was the big thing in those days. You had to leave and you needed a man-child, because that was what was going to carry on the name and your heritage. And if this son who killed the other one is put to death also, there's nobody left for my husband.
Right.
This was the issue of what she was bringing to David. Also, there was nobody else on the field to actually witness what took place. Mm-hmm. Did the other son actually swing a board at him and he hauled off and hit him with a shovel? What happened? There was nobody there. All they know is 2 sons went out and 1 came back. Mm-hmm. So there was that problem. And the other problem was the family had every right under the law to avenge the death of the 1 son. So we knew from Joab going and killing Abner, while he premeditated, it was the right of Joab to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, who Abner had killed. All right. So David, he instructs you go home, and I'm going to research this. I'm going to, and I'll make a decision, and I'll get back with you on the decision. All right. All right. So what she was doing was appealing to the king in his capacity as a judge. All right, verse 9. And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, My lord, O king, let the iniquity be on me and on my father's house, and the king and his throne be guiltless. So the king said, Whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you any more. Then she said, Please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not permit the avenger of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son. And he said, As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. All right, so what's going on here now is the woman talks to David, and she says to him, I understand you're the king, and I understand there's ramifications to your judgment. But let those ramifications fall on me. If you decide that my son should be killed, I will bear that responsibility, because I came to you. And if you judge that he should not be killed, and my relatives are going to be very upset, but I'm going to take that responsibility. I don't want it to fall on you. I brought the matter to you to be fairly judged. Okay, so that's what's being said here. And so what David said to her, he said, if anybody molests or bothers you, and there is an assumption here that if he says the son should live, and your relatives come over and harass you, you let me know. You bring them to me. And they're not going to harass you anymore. Assumption being, come here. Yeah. You see. Then the woman pleaded with David to remember the Lord God and not allow the avenger to any longer destroy, lest he destroy his son also. What she was asking David to do was to give an oath, his promise. Now she couldn't go to David and say, David, I need an oath from you. That would have been rude. That would have been saying, David, I don't trust you to make the right decision. So make it now, give me this oath. And David understood what she meant, even though she had done it in a very diplomatic manner. He assured her that she would not be harassed. Okay? He already assured her of that. Now he's assuring her that her son would be spared. Now he first said, you go home and I'll make the judgment. But now when she brings it again in this manner and says, I'm taking the responsibility and here's what could happen. He says, nobody's going to touch you. That's my promise. And nobody's going to touch a hair of your son, the hair of your. In other words, my decision is he's not going to be killed. Okay, so he made that decision already. All right. Now, whether this was a permanent decision or only covering the time that David felt he might take to make the decision, we're not told. But I think we can make the assumption that it was a permanent decision. All right, verse 12. Therefore the woman said, Please let your maidservant speak another word to my lord the king. And he said, Say on. So the woman said, Why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? Whoop. Does this sound like Nathan the prophet? Remember Nathan came with a parable to the prophet? And then when he had David hooked and David said, This is my decision, Nathan said, You are the man.
Yeah.
Now this woman isn't that direct. She's not saying, David, you're the one we're talking about here. She asked, Why have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? For the king speaks this thing as one who is guilty, in that the king does not bring his banished one home again. For we will surely die and become like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away a life, but he devises means so that his banished ones are not expelled from him. Now therefore I have come to speak of this thing to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. And your maidservant said, I will now speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his maidservant. For the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the inheritance of God. Your maidservant said, the word of my lord the king will now be comforting, for as the angel of God, so is my lord the king in discerning good and evil. And may the Lord your God be with you. Then the king answered and said to the woman, please do not hide from me anything that I ask you. And the woman said, please let my lord the king speak. Okay. What the woman is now doing is applying the parable. She didn't have two sons, one killed the other. This was a parable. It was a story. And she's now taking that story and she's applying it to the king. And she says, why have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? Now that's hard to figure out. What in the world is she talking about? What has this got to do with the kingdom of God or with the people of Israel? Well, the words of the woman as she applied the parable to David can be summed up like this, and this is from Barnes. If you have done right as regards my son, how is it that you harbor such a purpose of vengeance against Absalom as to keep him, one of God's people, an outcast in a pagan country, far from the worship of the God of Israel? Upon your own showing, you are guilty of a great fault in not allowing Absalom to return. And from the king, speaking this word, this sentence of absolution to my son, he is one guilty. As example, the sentence you have pronounced in favor of my son condemns your own conduct toward Absalom. David was willing to bypass the law in order to allow this woman's son to live. Okay? And yet when it comes to his own son, he's not willing to bypass the law. So what she's accusing David here of is showing favoritism. The opposite of what you might think. He showed favoritism to the woman's son. He did not show it to his own son. And God does not take away life. Interesting. In the case of every sin that deserves death, example David's own case in 2 Samuel 12, devises that the wanderer may not be forever expelled from him, as an example for the return of penitent sinners. The argument seems to be that every person will die. And just like water, once it's dead, once you pour out water, you can't go back and put it in the can or the pitcher. Take it out in the grass, pour it out, that's it. It's gone. All right? So life is like that. Once it's spilled on the ground, it can not be brought back. And since God did not allow Absalom to already die for his deed, God has devised a plan to allow him back into his previous position. Now that seems kind of out there. But when we apply that to Christianity today, isn't that really what happens today? Sinners deserve to die. They deserve not to breathe another breath. And yet God has devised a scheme whereby they can be redeemed, whereby they can be brought back into fellowship with God.
Right.
This was a precursor, a prerequisite type course that we're learning here about God's plan. In the New Testament, his plan was he devised a way where guilty sinners who deserved nothing under the law but absolute death, and yet God did not slay them. He allowed them to come back into fellowship with him because he put together a scheme, a plan, and it involved the cross and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But that's the plan, that's the scheme. Not everybody took it. Absalom could have said, no, I'm happy where I'm at.
Yeah.
And we'll find out later he almost wished he had. All right. The woman proposed that she was bringing this to the king because she was afraid of the people. She was not afraid of the people coming after her, or the people didn't even say anything to her. The fear was that the people themselves were getting nervous. They were getting worried. David could die at any time. The heir apparent was in a foreign country. What would happen if David died tomorrow? Who would ascend to the throne? Well, there's nobody stipulated because the only one's over there. So is Absalom going to put together an army from his grandfather and invade Israel and take the throne back? Or is he going to do it even before David dies? Will he get angry enough to try to take the throne back? And we'll find out later there were a lot of people who liked Absalom. Was he going to do that? Would there be a rebellion among the other sons? What would happen if David died? The heir apparent is down there. And not only is he down there, he's down there in a pagan land. He's learning idolatry. Would he bring that back and insert it into Israel? You see, there was a lot of questions that Israel had. Whether they were vocalizing them or not, they were still there. Just as David promised to deliver her and her son, so he should return David for the good of the inheritance of Israel. And when the woman asserted that the judgment of David would be comforting to her and to all Israel because he had wisdom like the angel of God to discern between good and bad, and God would be with him. Now this does not say David was the angel of God. It said he had wisdom like. That's what she's talking about. It promotes the idea that whatever David decided, it would be right. That was the confidence she had in him. So then David asked her to answer any questions he might ask, and she says she would. So verse 19. So the king said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in this?" Uh-oh!
Yeah.
Uh-oh. And the woman answered and said, "As you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. For your servant Joab commanded me, and he put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant, to bring about this change of affairs. Your servant Job has done this thing, but my Lord is wise, according to the wisdom of the angel of God, to know everything that is in the earth." Now keep in mind, Joab is standing there all the time. And the king said to Joab, "All right, I have granted this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom." Then Joab fell to the ground on his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord, O king, in that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant." So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, "Let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face." So Absalom returned to his own house, but did not see the king's face. All right, so here David discerns who had cooked this whole thing up, probably because only Joab would know the conflict that he was having over this. And so notice there was no animosity. There wasn't any, I'll talk to you later about this. He says, all right, I get it. I understand. You know, you've given me another perspective. I now see what you're talking about. And sometimes, you know, when we're talking to people, we want to present everything from our own perspective, and sometimes that's difficult, and they don't understand what we're talking about. But when we can give it from their perspective, and this little parable, Joab put the whole conflict, the whole matter, in a way, and in a picture frame, if you will, that allowed David to see it from a different angle from what he was thinking. And as soon as he looked at it with a fresh eyes of another vision, he said, okay, I agree. Go get him. Bring him back. It took wisdom to be able to see through the role of the woman played and to see that someone else was behind the scheme. And so when she asked the woman, notice that she did something interesting here. She assured David that there was no intent to bring unjustly, or to unjustly, probably a better way, to unjustly bring Absalom back, or to promote Absalom, but only to give David a different perspective in which to look at the situation. She did not come from the point of view, we love Absalom. I'm a follower of Absalom. You know, politics today, I was pointing out to my wife, there was an article in the paper, the president had these people, were giving them medals, you know, a medal of something or other for arts, and there was an actor on there, and he gave, and the paper says, you know, he gave him this medal, and this guy is a firm supporter of the president. And then it goes on and lists a whole bunch of other people that got stuff. Some of them I know are not supporters of the president. But it didn't say who was not a supporter of the president, who was not a supporter. Only the one. So the perspective here is that, well, he gave him that medal only because he was a supporter. He's a very good actor and been around a long time. Well-known actor. You see, it's a perspective that we get from other people. And what this woman told David, she said, we're not pushing Absalom, we're not building him up, we're only giving you a different perspective. Look at it from this view, from this perspective. Also, notice this, David's reply. He says, all right, I've granted this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom. Absalom wasn't that young a man. He had sheep and he had shears and he had, you know, he wasn't a teenager, but you might assume from the words young man. He waited at least 2 years after the event with Tamar. So he was not a young man. And yet David says, go get the young man. What was David saying? David was mitigating Absalom's actions to that of a young, foolhardy youth.
Yeah.
Again, perspective, words. Words are so important. They give us a picture, or they put something in our minds, and we can't get rid of that. And so people that heard that would say, Absalom must be a young guy, probably a teenager, maybe he's in his 20s, you know. He's probably in his 40s, I don't know. All right, Joab prostrated himself before David and thanked him. And I like the way this says, it fell on his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight. You didn't kill me. You didn't take off my head. I must have found favor in your sight. My little ploy worked. You see? He was probably greatly relieved. I can see him standing there, and when David says, is this Joab's plan? I can see him turn white as a sheet. Remember, he was around when Saul was throwing javelins. See, he may have thought David might just take one at me. All right. And then David added something at the bottom. He said he can come to his own house, he can live in his home, but he cannot see me. I cannot be face to face with him. What did that mean? That means Absalom was basically placed under house arrest. He could not go to any royal functions. He couldn't go to the feast. He couldn't go to the events that the royal sons all went to. He lived a life of seclusion. All right. Verse 25. Now in all Israel, there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when they cut the hair of his head at the end of every year, he cut it because it was heavy on him. When he cut it, he weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels, according to the king's standard. To Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. So Absalom was as near perfect as possible. There did not seem to be anything wrong or in his appearance that made him undesirable. His main characteristic was his hair. And he had so much hair that every year he had to cut it because it got so long. Now, the weight there would be about 3 pounds, in excess of 3 pounds. Now, that's something I've never had to worry about. You might get 2 ounces at best on my hair, you know. But he had all of this heavy hair, and so he was somebody who was very desirable. He seemed to be somebody like Saul. You remember, they chose Saul to be king because of his appearance. Not because of his ability, not because of his heart, but because of his appearance. So now we see Absalom coming on the scene with this same kind of appearance. Everybody looked and said, wow, that's Absalom. Saul, they said, that's Saul because he was 6'4" or 5 tall. Absalom was average size, but he was so handsome. All right, it says here he had 3 sons and 1 daughter. Now we're not sure when they were born. If some of them were born before he killed Amnon, or if they were born over in his grandfather's place. However, it seems that the 3 boys died, probably right after childbirth, or perhaps even before they were named. There are no names given. And so his daughter, Tamar, who he named after his aunt, who was very beautiful, just like her aunt, was the only one that remained. According to 2 Samuel 18:18, Absalom said that he went out and put up a pillar out in the forest, and he put his name on it because he had no male heirs, no sons. And this was a pillar to his posterity. When Absalom died, he left no male heirs. All right, finally verse 28. And Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. Therefore Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not come. So he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. I don't know if I'd do that to the commander of the army. You know, that's a pretty bold step. Then Joab arose and came to Absalom's house and said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? And Absalom answered Joab, look, I sent to you saying, come here, so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be still there. Now therefore, Therefore, let me see the king's face. But if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me. So Joab went to the king and told him. And when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. Then the king kissed Absalom. All right, after 2 years living in Jerusalem in seclusion, basically, not being involved in anything and being basically under house arrest, he decided to talk to Joab, have Joab come and go see the king. Now remember, he's still the king's son. He's still a prince, and he's now heir apparent. And so what he ordered Joab, Joab had to do. Okay, so he was under, that. And so when he said to Joab to come to him, Joab didn't come. He just ignored him. He said, I'm not going over there. I know what he wants. I ain't not going over there. I'm not going to get involved in this. And so Absalom, he goes out and sets Joab's field on fire. I laugh every time I read that. I said, how else are you going to get his attention? Set his fields on fire. He got his attention. And so he had to come. You see, he had now to go to Absalom to get recompense for the loss of his barley. Because Absalom was bound under the law now to pay for the barley. So Absalom knew that he would come. And sure enough, here he came. So he tells him, he says, you go tell the king, why did you bring me here if you're just going to let me sit here in seclusion? I would be better off in my grandfather's. I can move around. I was well known in the town. I could leave my house. I could do what I wanted to do. And you brought me here, and it's been misery for 2 years. I'd be better off over there. And then there was the kicker. Now, first of all, he knew that Joab was the one who got David to bring him back in the first place. So he also figured Joab had David's ear and would have better success. But he said here, if there is iniquity in me, let me see David face to face. If he sees iniquity in me, this iniquity, obviously he had killed he killed Amnon, so we say, yeah, you got iniquity, you're a murderer. But this really has more to do with an attitude. Am I an evil person? If you see wickedness in me, I avenged my sister. Now, is that iniquity? It may have violated the law. It may not have. But it was an act of judgment against the person who assaulted my sister. So if there's any iniquity, if there's any wickedness or evilness in me, put me to death. Just get it over with. If not, let me back in. And so David agreed. Bring him. And as soon as David saw him, what did he do? He kissed him. And in those days, kissing, like in that case, with one on each cheek, was a sign that you were now accepted into the family. And this even in you see the mafia movies, the Italians. Is still practiced in some places that if you're not accepted until you are kissed on each cheek. It's a sign of welcome and saying you are accepted with us. If that doesn't happen, it means they're not sure who you are. All right, any questions?
No, that was a good lesson.